Something extraordinary is happening on the battlefields of Eastern Europe, and almost no one is talking about it. Tanks that should be in museums are being brought back to life. Soldiers who traditionally fought protected by armor are now advancing on motorcycles and on foot. And the most powerful man in Russia is making desperate calls to dictators of countries he used to despise. What you're about to discover will completely change your perception of one of the world's most feared military powers. The truth is that Russia is facing something even its worst enemies never imagined possible: the complete collapse of a military empire built over 70 years. This isn't just the story of a conflict, it's the story of how a superpower became dependent on its own vassals to survive. To understand the Russian crisis, we need to know Soviet military history. The Soviet Union wasn't just a country prepared for conflict, it was an entire nation turned into a gigantic arms factory. During the Second World War, from 1941 to 1945, the Soviets produced numbers that defy imagination. 19.83 million rifles, 98,300 tanks, and self-propelled vehicles, plus hundreds of thousands of artillery pieces. But that was only the beginning. During the 45 years of the Cold War that followed, the Soviet Union built what was perhaps the largest conventional military arsenal in human history. We're talking about approximately 140,000 main battle tanks, more than 400,000 armored vehicles of various types, 60,000 artillery pieces, and tens of millions of shells of all calibers. To put that in perspective, that arsenal alone was larger than the combined armed forces of all NATO countries at the time. The Soviet collapse in 1991 created a unique situation in military history. Imagine an empire obsessively prepared for the big showdown that never came, leaving behind military depots spread across 11 time zones, from the borders with Poland to the Pacific coasts. These arsenals weren't just large, they were monuments to Soviet military thinking that prioritized massive quantity over technological sophistication. For over 3 decades after 1991, this military heritage remained a seemingly inexhaustible strategic reserve. Thousands of military depots, many still secret today, stored this legacy under Siberian skies and Russian steppes. Maintenance was sporadic, storage conditions often inadequate, and the corrosion of time did its relentless work. Even so, the quantity was so colossal that Russian leadership believed these stocks would last generations. In July 2025, the KSE Institute published a report that shook Western defense circles, disassembling the Russian war machine, logistics, choke points, and dependencies. This was not just another academic study. It was a detailed autopsy of the most significant military collapse since the end of the Soviet Union itself. The report reveals a shocking truth few imagined possible just 3 years ago. Soviet stocks of tanks, armored vehicles, and artillery platforms are shrinking drastically, with deliveries from storage bases falling by more than 25% in 2024 alone. But the raw numbers only scratch the surface of this historic transformation. Since the start of large-scale operations, Russia has completely lost 2,600 main battle tanks. That's more tanks than many NATO countries have in their entire arsenals. Add to that 1,900 armored personnel carriers and 4,100 infantry fighting vehicles destroyed, and you get a picture of devastation surpassing equipment losses of many entire 20th century conflicts. Artillery losses tell an even more dramatic story. Nearly 2,000 systems have been completely wiped out. Artillery has always been the dominant arm of Russian military thinking, inherited directly from Soviet doctrine. Losing almost 2,000 artillery systems isn't just material loss, it's a blow to the very identity of the Russian military. But here's the detail that makes this situation truly extraordinary. These numbers represent only completely destroyed and visually verified equipment. The rigorous methodology used means hundreds, possibly thousands, of other vehicles damaged in prolonged maintenance or simply worn out by heavy use don't appear in these statistics. The final result of this material bleeding is impressive. The number of tanks and armored vehicles Russia has available in its stocks now is below 7,000 units, a 20-fold reduction compared to the 140,000 the Soviet Union had in 1990. This isn't just decline, it's slow-motion collapse. What we're witnessing on Ukrainian battlefields is something no modern military analyst expected to see, a kind of real-time military archaeology. The shortage of contemporary equipment has forced Russia to literally resurrect mechanical ghosts from past eras, creating a surreal spectacle where tanks that should be in museums now face drones and satellite-guided missiles. The famous T-54 and T-55 tanks, designs dating back to 1946 to 1950, are being pulled not just from military depots but monuments and even museums. These vehicles entered service when Joseph Stalin still ruled the Soviet Union and Dwight Eisenhower was an unknown American general. The situation gets even stranger when we look at the T-72B and T-80 tanks from the 1970s. Although more modern than their 1940s predecessors, these vehicles suffer from problems revealing decades of neglect and improper storage. Electrical systems degrade to the point they often fail under combat conditions. Optics are damaged or unusable, and communication electronics can't integrate with modern command and control systems. But the problem goes far beyond the age of the equipment. During decades of storage in poorly ventilated, often unheated depots in the vast Siberian expanses, these vehicles suffered systematic deterioration. Armor shows extensive corrosion, weld points became brittle due to extreme thermal changes, and engines require maintenance, sometimes more costly than the vehicle's residual value. The most worrying operational aspect is that communication systems on these old vehicles do not support modern encryption. This means all communications between crews and higher commands can be easily intercepted by Ukrainian forces, turning every radio transmission into a potential tactical trap. There's also a tragic human dimension to this situation. Crews trained on modern equipment now need to operate machines their grandparents might have used, often with instruction manuals outdated by decades and spare parts that simply no longer exist on the global market. One of the most visible consequences of this equipment crisis is what military experts call the demechanization of Russian forces. Troops that would traditionally operate armored vehicles now resort to motorcycles, civilian pickups, and even moving on foot. Though this tactical shift offers greater mobility over rough terrain and makes forces less detectable by some sensor types, it comes with a terrible cost. Exposed soldiers are much more vulnerable targets for drones, artillery, and small arms. Russian infantry casualties have risen drastically as a direct result of this forced exposure. The most humiliating transformation in modern Russian military history isn't on the battlefields, but in diplomatic meeting rooms. The country that for decades exported arms to half the world now finds itself making desperate calls to dictators it once considered inferior. This role reversal has created one of the 21st century's most extraordinary geopolitical paradoxes. North Korea, with an economy smaller than many world states, has become Russia's most crucial military supplier. Numbers revealed by the KSE Institute report are simply staggering. Between 4 and 6 million North Korean artillery shells were sent to Russia in 2024. To put this figure into perspective, Russia's own military industry couldn't produce more than 2.3 million shells in the same period, meaning an economically isolated country is supplying almost 3 times more ammunition than the supposed military power. The logistics for this massive arms transfer created one of the most unusual trade routes of the modern era. Ships named Angara, Maria, Lady R, and Maya regularly sail between the North Korean port of Rajan and Russian bases, transporting not only conventional shells, but also dozens of modern short-range ballistic missiles. Each of these voyages is a silent confession of Russian industrial inadequacy. Iran added another layer of complexity to this dependency network. Across the Caspian Sea, Tehran sent approximately 13,000 tons of explosives, including unguided rockets and technical components that reinforced not only Russian artillery, but also provided know-how for local production. This Iranian technological transfer represents something unthinkable during the Soviet era, Russia learning military techniques from a country it once taught. China, meanwhile, plays a subtler but equally crucial role. By supplying precision machine tools, electronic components, and special powders, Beijing enables Russian factories to keep running despite the harshest Western economic sanctions. This Chinese dependency is particularly ironic given that for decades the Soviet Union was China's military and technological mentor. The psychological dimension of this dependency can't be underestimated. Vladimir Putin, who built his reputation as a strong and self-sufficient leader, now needs Kim Jong-un's approval to keep his military operations running. Every shipment of North Korean or Iranian ammunition represents not just material supply, but symbolic erosion of Russian strategic sovereignty. The shortage of adequate equipment is taking a devastating human toll. Russia is likely to hit 1 million casualties by summer 2025, a grim and impressive milestone. This number includes dead, wounded, and captured, representing a population bleed Russia will take decades to recover from. The pace of Russian advances also reflects this equipment crisis. Russian forces have advanced an average of only 50 meters per day in areas like Kharkiv, slower than during the Somme offensive, where French and British forces made greater progress with technology a century old. To compensate for the lack of armor, Moscow has ramped up drone use. This tactical shift is a forced adaptation to circumstances, not an ideal strategic choice. Drones, while effective at causing damage and terror, can't occupy and hold territory the way mechanized ground forces can. Massive drone deployment has grown exponentially, but even this resource has limits. Drones are vulnerable to electronic warfare, bad weather, and air defense systems. Moreover, they rely on sophisticated electronic components that, due to sanctions, are increasingly hard to get. One of the most intriguing aspects of this crisis is that Russia isn't a small or technologically backward country. It has a considerable industrial base and a tradition in military production. Yet, decades of corruption, mismanagement, and over-reliance on inherited stocks have created a situation where the country can't replace its equipment at the needed pace. Russia seems on track to produce almost 3 times more artillery shells than the United States and Europe combined, but even this ramped-up production can't keep up with the voracious consumption of the current conflict. It's like trying to fill a bathtub with a hole in the bottom. No matter how much water you add, the level keeps dropping. The KSC Institute report makes a prediction echoing the original Soviet collapse. 2025 will be the last year Russia can count on its massive inherited stocks of conventional weapons. This is an optimistic speculation by Western analysts, but a conclusion based on concrete data on logistics flows, consumption rates, and industrial capacity. To grasp the magnitude of this historic transition, we must understand we're witnessing the effective end of an era that began with Stalinist military industrialization in the 1930s. For nearly a century, Russian military strength relied on the premise that massive quantity could compensate for limited technological sophistication. This military philosophy, forged in the furnaces of the Second World War and refined during the Cold War, is coming to its definitive end. The Institute's data indicate that unless an unexpected and fundamental change occurs in Russian industrial dynamics, large-scale hostilities may gradually decrease by late 2025 or early 2026, not by strategic choice, but by material impossibility. Russia simply won't have enough tanks, armored vehicles, and artillery to sustain extensive mechanized operations. This timeline prediction doesn't necessarily mean the complete end of hostilities, but suggests a radical transformation in the nature of Russian military operations. Without capacity to conduct large-scale mechanized operations, Russia may be forced to fundamentally reconsider not just its military strategy, but its global geopolitical posture. What we're witnessing is more than a simple military equipment crisis. It's the symbolic end of the Soviet military legacy and the start of a new geopolitical reality where Russia can no longer rely solely on its traditional military power to project influence. The Russian war machine, built over decades of Soviet investment, is disintegrating before our eyes. Putin, who built his image as a strong, independent leader, now finds himself dependent on the goodwill of lesser allies to keep his military ambitions alive. This transformation will have consequences far beyond the current conflict. The world is witnessing the decline of one of the last military superpowers of the 20th century and the birth of a new world order where power isn't based just on arsenal size, but on capacity for innovation, adaptation, and industrial sustainability. History will remember this period as the moment Russia went from predator to dependent, from power to supplicant, marking definitively the end of the Soviet era and the start of a new phase in global military history. However, to conclude, I want to highlight that the depletion of the Soviet arsenal doesn't mean Russia is out of weapons or ammunition. Nations hold stockpiles of arms and equipment because in conflict times usage exceeds production. In other words, with the Soviet arsenal depleted, we won't see a ceasefire in Ukraine, but we may see delays in frontline deliveries. This channel values truthfulness and quality of facts, but since we're talking about a conflict, that means data obtained may suffer from government military propaganda. However, we use empirical confirmation methods to seek the highest quality of information.